Imagine, not the John Lennon song, but imagine that you own a sprawling estate, right by the sea, if you may. In the initial years, you had high hopes for it. Sort of like Jay Gatsby throwing extravagant parties just to attract Daisy to come over the bay. But becoming rational in your old age, you realize that there has been underutilization of the resources and you decide to rent out portions of it to young and ambitious people. The idea was twofold: optimum utilization of the resources and some hope that revenue will come your way to help out with your other expenses. After all, just about to hit your 60s, and while you don't plan on stopping, or rather you cannot really stop, you would rather let the young guns run the show from now on. And oh man, what a show they end up running. Your sleepy old estate has suddenly come to life. At any minute in the day, there are swarms of people jostling to come in through your gates. The gates themselves have been thrown apart from their very hinges. You're pleased to see that many of these new visitors are people who could have never in their wildest dreams imagined to be there maybe just a decade ago. But hold on. What's this that you see? These young people have started renting out your common grounds for weddings? Hey, there are startups in your many garages. And your vintage cars, a fine collection of it, is being showcased for road shows around the globe. Hey, what's happening here? All of this must be bringing in some revenue at least, you figure, and decide to ask for a share in it. After all, these are your resources which are being used to earn them. But wait, these tenants of yours now argue that even the basic rent you charge, and not a penny of which they have paid so far, by the way, even that is too high. Let alone a share in the enhanced revenues that they're earning from your resources, they don't even want to give you your basic rent. After pleadings and negotiations, when the tenants refuse to budge from their position, you put down your foot and drag them to court. And in the courts, the matter drags you along. Your tenants, which were until recently finding the rent you were asking for to being too high, now chose to hire the most expensive set of lawyers on earth and banded against you. It was a wild ride, but after 20 years, finally the court orders came. Justice had rung your bell, and the court had ordered your tenants to pay up, with interest, of course. Happy and pleased, you go to the tenants and try to enforce the order. Hold on, the story is far from being over. The tenants now throw up their hands and say, well, we don't really have any money. Wait, what? All those parties, all those renting out, all those things that you're doing, I saw money exchange hands. Where is all that money? They just shrugged. Tired, yet determined, you ask, now what? I just want my money and be done with this. One tiny insolvent tenant of yours with a squeaky voice shrieks from the back of the room, why don't we sell the property and pay your dues with the proceeds we get? Pro tanto, of course. Pro tanto, for non-lawyers out there, is a common concept in commercial lending arrangements whereby a mortgaged asset, when sold, the proceeds of it are adjusted against the legitimate claims that are to be paid off to the creditors, and the balance which remains is given back to the original debtor whose property is sold. If you catch the irony of its use in my story, please do let me know in the comments later. Of course, you've seen the title for this episode and you know by now that the story I just made up is just an allegory for the mess which is currently being argued in the Supreme Court, at the time of recording this episode, of course. So let me just give you a brief history of this entire issue. In 1994, via the National Telecom Policy, NTP 94 for short, gave out licenses to private players to operate on allocated spectrum, essentially radio waves which are used to transmit data. This allocated spectrum was to be used by these private players to provide cellular services on them. Licenses had to be issued under Section 4 of the Indian Telegraph Act 1885. Yes, it is still prevalent from the year 1885. Ideally, it was made for wireless telegraphs but has been modified in its use to even cover modern day technologies. Anyway, under Section 4 of the Indian Telegraph Act 1885, the government has an exclusive right to establish, work and maintain telegraph services in the country. Ergo, to establish, maintain and work cellular services in the country. However, proviso to Section 4 provides the government with the right to give out licenses whereby private players can enter the field. It is done in exchange for a fees, let's say, a license fees. It is a fees that the government charges for parting with an exclusive privilege. It is a license to use, not transfer of ownership. After the initial licenses were allotted, the telecom companies complained that the license fees that was being charged, by the way not paid yet, was way too high. A new regime was brought in via the National Telecom Policy of 1999, NTP 99 for short, whereby existing license terms were revised. Most particularly relevant for our discussion here, telecom companies were now asked to shell out a share of the gross revenue that they will earn every year. This started from 15% in that year and dropped down to 8% in 2013. This gross revenue was of course to be adjusted for tax and other charges that telecom companies were already meant to pay to the government. What you get thus is adjusted gross revenue. In a definition, gross revenue minus call charges that you have to pay to the government, minus the service tax, minus other charges that you already have to pay to the government from the gross revenue anyway. With me so far? Great. Now, disputes arose regarding the definition of this AGR. Like my story above, telecom companies were using this right to use spectrum in a lot of creative ways, not just to provide cellular services but a lot of allied services as well. All of these allied services earned them revenue, and government wanted a share of all of it. Telecom companies also were not standalone operations. You had to have deep pockets in order to get these licenses, and most of these telecom companies had promoter holding companies which were engaged in their own myriad businesses before they were given the license. In their excitement, this boundary between the holding promoter company and these subsidiary companies was forgotten, and a lot of activities were undertaken, a lot of them which continue to haunt these companies till date. But more on this later. So far, what I've told you is this. Section 4 of the Telegraph Act gives government the exclusive right to operate, maintain and work telegraph services in the country. Ergo, cellular services in the country. Via a license given under Section 4, telecom companies had a right to use the spectrum allocated to them to provide cellular services. Initially, they were being asked to shell out a license fee. On their protest, the government decided to cut that license fee into a revenue sharing model whereby telecom companies were asked to shell out a percentage of the gross revenue that they earned from their operations. The issue became about the definition of those adjusted gross revenue, on the basis of which the percentage was to be calculated. I'll quickly digress to share a related concept through which national governments across the globe earn revenue, literally out of thin air travel. And I'm not referring to national carriers in which a national government may have majority shareholding, like we have in Air India. No. What I'm referring to may sound impressive or bizarre to you, maybe both. You see, governments have an exclusive right on the air above their physical territory. While majority of the world is covered with water, commercial air travel is only feasible if you're able to fly above with the airspace for different countries. But countries having sovereign authority over the use of their airspace sometimes restrict access to it. China and Russia, for example, had for the longest time restricted access to only flights that were coming from other communist nations. In fact, even today, if you or anyone you know was trying to go to Russia for the FIFA Football World Cup, you would have become acutely aware of the dearth in flights operating in and out of that country. Anyway, most countries charge aircraft for each journey they undertake in their airspace. Universal rules are missing in this regard, so some countries like the USA will only charge for the distance for which an aircraft is using its airspace, while a country like India will charge for the distance covered, weight of the aircraft before the taking off had taken place. Interesting fact, in the aftermath to the Balakot airstrike that we took, Pakistan closed its airspace for any flights that were moving towards Indian airspace. Now, Pakistan geographically is a smaller entity and is completely shadowed with India. So, nearly all the flights that were moving from Pakistan towards the eastern side would have had to cross Indian airspace, which meant that most of these flights just chose to ignore the country altogether. It resulted in a loss of $100 million, estimated, of course, for Pakistan. Now back to the AGR story. In 2003, the telecom companies approached the Telecom Disputes Appellate Tribunal via Section 14 Tri-Act petition challenging Department of Telecommunications (DOT) assessment of AGR. They contended, and the TDSAT conceded, that telecom companies can only be asked to share their revenues which are earned in pursuance of the activities solely undertaken under Section 4 license. To simplify it, telecom companies can only pay for the main activities which were covered under the license which was given to them, that is cellular services. Allied activities which are taken as part of their exercise of their license rights will not be subject to the revenue sharing agreement. TDSAT, while making this argument, also said that TRI was supposed to be consulted on the matter of license fee, and by not consulting TRI, the DOT had made a huge error. It asked TRI to weigh in on the issue, and based on the recommendations of TRI, would pass the final orders as to the calculation of AGR. While TRI was contemplating their recommendations, DOT challenged the TDSAT's order in the Supreme Court. However, during the pendency of that appeal, TRI came out with their order with their recommendations, which were accepted by TDSAT. Now, the definition for AGR which was accepted by TDSAT finally was an extremely watered down version, and DOT again appealed to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court in the 2011 judgment stated that since the license agreement that the telecom companies had entered into with the Department of Telecommunication voluntarily that they had undertaken contained a definition for AGR, that definition was complete in itself, and an assessment taken under that definition should not be challenged, since these companies are already earning revenues under the same agreement without any protest. An additional question which was decided by the Supreme Court was with respect to the jurisdiction of TRI or TDSAT in interfering with the terms and conditions of the license agreement. While deciding on this question, the Supreme Court observed that the licensees were merely trying to wriggle out of their commitment under the license. The grant of the license is a form of a contract. TRAI, while it can make recommendations with respect to the license fee, cannot bind the government or the licensees to those recommendations. These were merely recommendations that the government can choose to accept or reject. Further on, TDSAT can only decide on the validity can only decide on any dispute which happens between the licensor and the licensee under the license agreement itself. However, the validity of the license agreement is paramount in order to establish this relationship between a licensor and a licensee. When a licensee is challenging the very terms and conditions of the license, they are challenging the validity of this license. Thereby, they are challenging the existence of this relationship between them as a licensor and a licensee. If there does not exist a relationship between a licensor and a licensee, what is the scope of a dispute in the first place? The Supreme Court said, of course, the agreement, considering it was voluntarily entered into between the parties, it has to be considered to be a valid agreement. Under that agreement, during the operation of those terms and conditions, if any dispute arises, the TDSAT can very well decide on those disputes. However, when someone is trying to challenge the very validity of the license itself, of the very validity of the contract itself, that cannot be permitted. Further on, they said that since the definition of AGR was clear that even outside revenues will form part of it, telecom companies by choosing to undertake those activities cannot avoid the liability that arises thereof. Essentially, since telecom companies knew that they can be asked to share revenues undertaken for activities outside of Section 4, what was allowed under Section 4, meaning to say the allied activities which are undertaken in pursuance of their license agreement, they cannot avoid the responsibility to pay off the revenues that are arising out of them. Having said this, the Supreme Court accepted the appeal and set aside the TDSAT order. However, immediately after that, these telecom companies started again going to TDSAT to argue under this revised framework given to them by the Supreme Court that while you cannot challenge the terms of the license itself, you can have a dispute under the license and which can be decided by TDSAT. So these telecom companies tried to present their older arguments in the garb of being arguments to be undertaken under the terms and conditions of the license, and still challenged the competition that was being made by the DOT. This, if you're familiar with the concept of res judicata, that is, once a matter has been decided, it cannot be argued upon or it cannot be tried upon again. This action of TDSAT was a clear violation of that, and it was challenged as such in the Supreme Court again, which gave a final order in 2019 settling the matter once and for all. Now in this part, I'll be discussing the myriad activities which the subsidiary companies had started undertaking and which enhanced their respective dues. I'd earlier talked about how under some sort of excitement, the companies had forgotten there existed a distinction between the holding company and the subsidiary companies, and it undertook just about a number of activities due to which their revenue tally increased, and so did the share that they had to give to the government. Now, it is important to start off the discussion of the 2019 Supreme Court decision by referring to the voluntary nature of the contract that the telecom companies had entered into with the government. It is not that they had entered into one single agreement also. While that would not have discounted any argument, but it is important to remember that they had entered into two different separate agreements. First, the 1994 agreement, after which they protested that the terms of that agreement are too steep license fee, which the telecom companies were finding unfeasible for their operations. Government, after conceding that okay, we will look into this matter, they offered another deal, a revamped migrated plan whereby they were asked to share the revenues, and the telecom companies voluntarily conceded. No one put a gun to their head. The Supreme Court took note of this voluntary nature, and they said that the licensees cannot have to be stopped from reneging on their commitments in this matter. Now, while deciding on the definition of AGR itself, first of all, Supreme Court said that the earlier 2011 judgment whereby they said that the AGR definition has to be in accordance with the license terms and conditions of the license, and that TDSAT cannot decide upon the definition of AGR itself, has to be upheld. Further on, they sought to give more clarity on this issue by stating that certain activities which were being cited by the telecom companies as being outside the realm and scope of the license agreement itself and should not be considered for the computation of revenue share. So Supreme Court sought to give a clarity on those issues, and in the 156 long judgment, a major portion of it has been devoted to settling this issue itself. The first item for consideration were the discounts that were offered by telecom companies. This could be in form of free calls, free SMS, free data that were given. Now, Supreme Court said that such various forms of discounts, commissions, prepaid vouchers, goodwill waiver, etc., raised on behalf of the licensees will form part of the gross revenue. Since these were not undertaken by them on account of some goodwill, but rather it was a part of an overall commercial strategy to increase their business. And hence, such discounts have to be taken part of the gross revenue. Second, whether gain and loss based on fluctuations in exchange rate can be considered. An agreement when entered into and an agreement when executed, the underlying value of which is a foreign currency, will definitely undergo a change depending on the changing exchange rate of the foreign currency. Now, it can be to their benefit, it can be to their disadvantage. The licensees said that the gains on the back of foreign exchange fluctuations are unrealized gains and purely notional. And this argument again was rejected by the Supreme Court, and they said that forex gain has to be accounted for and has to be considered as part of the gross revenue. Further on, in case the subsidiary company held shares in other ventures, whether the capital gains that were to be earned on the sale of those shares were to be considered as part of the revenue. Insurance claim in respect of capital assets, the Supreme Court said that has to be included, because if not, then any gain which is made on receiving insurance claim for a destroyed asset, it will not be treated as revenue. Supreme Court said no, it has to be treated as revenue. Another argument was on account of amount of negative balance of prepaid customers. So a lot of companies started this scheme for prepaid customers whereby when their balances went down below the amount of zero, basically if I have recharged my phone with a prepaid balance of 15 rupees and I have made calls worth about 25 rupees, whether the negative balance has to be included in this tally, the Supreme Court said of course yes, considering that when I will recharge my phone again, let's say for another 15 rupees, my balance will not show 15 rupees freshly, it will show rupees 5. It will deduct the negative 10 rupees that were already there in my prepaid balance account. So basically, the Supreme Court said that this amount is never really lost. You're going to gain this amount anyway, so this has to be included in gross revenue. Then reimbursement of the infrastructure operating expenses, basically rent received from leasing out any passive infrastructure such as a cell phone tower. The telecom company said that since this is a non-licensed activity, these should not be included. TDSAT had said that these should be included, but the operating expenses have to be distributed between the players who are sharing this. The Supreme Court said that accounting jugglery would take place in case we are allowing this, because in that case, let's say I am operating a telephone tower and another player wants to use the same, in the revenue sharing agreement that we execute of, let's say, 100 rupees, we make it look as such 90 rupees of that is being paid in terms of expenses. That accounting jugglery will ensure that only 10 rupees from the 100 rupees that the company is earning will be considered as part of revenue. The Supreme Court said that such jugglery will not be allowed. Thus, the entire amount to be received by a licensee on account of sharing passive infrastructure will be counted in calculating the gross revenue. The next issue was waiver of late fee. Again, it was considered to be a promotional tool, that even, let's say, a postpaid customer is not paying his dues on time, and the fine that has to be imposed on the same is being waived off by the telecom company. It has to be considered as part of their commercial strategy, and since an accounting has been done for the same, it will be considered as revenue. Next, gains from revenue charges and PST and pass-through charges. Now, pass-through charges are something which are paid by service providers to other service providers for allowing their subscribers' call to be carried on their network. Let's say I'm operating only in 5 circles in the country. There are 26 circles in the country. I'm only operating in 5 circles in the country. If my subscriber is traveling outside of these 5 circles in which I'm operating and is making a call outside of these 5 circles, that call has to be carried through the spectrum belonging to another company. Now, the charges for this will be paid by the original company of which I am a subscriber. These are known as pass-through charges. Now, if I'm earning pass-through charges, I have to consider them as revenue. However, what happens many a times, the same company pays to itself such charges. For instance, and this happens a lot in roaming charges in the earlier times when there was a roaming charge. So let's say I'm living in Delhi, I'm a subscriber of the company in Delhi. It also has operation in Mumbai. It is also operating the circle in Mumbai. Because I've traveled to that circle, I'm being charged for the roaming. However, that charge is being paid to the same company. In this case, what the company was trying to seek was that since I'm not earning anything on this particular transaction, I should not be allowed, this should not be considered as revenue. However, the Supreme Court did not agree on that and said it has to be included. Again, for non-refundable deposits for getting a new connection, Supreme Court said it has to be included. License fee demanded when spectrum is not granted. The Supreme Court said that, let's say you hold a license, but when you do not have any circle in which you're operating, in that case, any allied activity which is undertaken by you, it will be unreasonable on part of the government to demand any revenue which you may earn on the basis of that. It will be unreasonable for the government to demand a share in that revenue, and the Supreme Court considered that this does not have to be paid. Income from interest and dividend, the Supreme Court said yes. If you did not want to, or if you wanted to avoid sharing revenue in this respect, you should not have held shares through this company, which is what I was talking about earlier when they said that companies just forgot the distinction between the holding company and the subsidiary company. And because of that, they had to pay a lot more than they would have had to. These subsidiary companies, it was not a paramount necessity that they should hold on to such shares and debts and other things. It could have been held on behalf of the holding company by any other company as well. However, since the subsidiary company which held the license was also owning such assets, any interests that were being earned on the back of any debt that they had issued, or any dividend that they were earning on shares, it had to be accounted for. Bad debts written off had to be included in the revenue calculation. Similarly, a liability once written off was asked to be added as income from the business. Intercorporate loans. Now this is an interesting concept. A lot of times what was happening was that the subsidiary company requiring any amount of funds, requiring any fresh infusion of funds, would ask its holding company to procure a loan on its behalf, and the holding company would transfer off that loan amount to the subsidiary company. The subsidiary company in turn will pay the principal and the interest to such a holding company, which in turn will pay off the source from which such a debt was obtained. Essentially, the holding company was working as a middleman in this entire equation. Now, considering that the holding companies recover the debt servicing obligations from such subsidiary companies and paid further to the bank, for the purpose of calculating gross revenue, any form of interest of any earned by anyone would have had to be included. So since the holding company was earning an interest from this subsidiary company, it could not be discounted as an expense and it had to be accounted for as gross revenue. Or else again, some sort of accounting jugglery would happen, which the Supreme Court wanted to avoid. Then revenue under IP1 registration, the Supreme Court said has to be included. Income from management consulting services, this was done in regard to some activity that Airtel had undertaken. The Supreme Court said yes, it has to be undertaken as well. Now comes the most important part, levy of interest, penalty and interest on penalty. According to the license agreement, in case the license fee is not paid on time, which I think it was a very small time, it was some 45 or 60 days. Now we are talking about 17 years here. They were asked to pay this amount in 2001, 2002 and they did not even pay the amount of 2019. So the DOT had said that since they have earned heavy revenues under this license during this entire phase, they can't avoid imposition of penalty in terms of the same license. The Supreme Court conceded to this argument and added that no litigant can be permitted to reap fruits on such inconsistent and untenable stands and litigate for decades in several rounds. Essentially that the telecom companies should not be allowed to reap benefits of their own doing, that because they had undertaken such litigation, when the terms and conditions of their license agreement were clear enough, they had still decided to undertake this litigation. They can't choose to hide behind the argument that since we were undertaking this litigation, we had not paid the amount and we should not be asked to pay the interest or penalty or interest on penalty. Hence, they were asked to pay penalty, interest, fines and the interest on such fines and penalties as well for 17 years. Now, the telecom companies, of course, did not possess such huge amounts at one go. The total liability is something above 1.6 lakh crore rupees. Let the figure sink in your head. 1.6 lakh crore rupees is pending in dues from these telecom companies, which is now saying that they don't have the resources to pay this money off. To the question, where did the money go? Well, in recent years, because of Reliance Jio coming into the market and offering services at a substantially lesser price point than their competitors, Airtel, Vodafone, all of these companies have had to eat up into their revenues and provide the same services at a matching price so as in order to compete with Reliance Jio. Even then, it cannot be undertaken as an argument in favor of these telecom companies, since they knew the outcome of a litigation can go either way. They should have accounted for this amount, and thus no concession should be made in their favor. Now, these telecom companies are currently arguing in the Supreme Court for a reduction in the amount, and the Supreme Court has categorically denied any possibility that such a relief can ever be granted to them. In turn, they are asking for favorable payment terms. One company even suggesting, not even just company, the Department of Telecommunication itself suggesting that a payment period of 20 years be accepted, that the companies be allowed to pay off this amount in the next coming 20 years. The Supreme Court again rejected this argument. Initially, the companies were asked to pay this amount by the end of the financial year 2020. Of course, 1.6 lakh crores is a huge amount, and they could not really pay off that much in one go. Some companies like Airtel have already started paying off their due amount. Reliance Jio has already paid off the due amount that was expected of it to pay. However, there are other companies which during this entire time have filed for insolvency under the IBC. These companies are Aircel, Videocon and Reliance Communication, led by Anil Ambani. Now, in the case of the companies Videocon and Aircel, their spectrum is currently being used by Airtel, and the Supreme Court has said that considering that Airtel is deriving the benefit out of the spectrum, the AGR dues in respect of Videocon and Aircel should be paid off by Airtel. Similarly, in the case of Reliance Communication, since the spectrum is being used by Reliance Jio, the Supreme Court is considering the possibility that Reliance Jio should pay off their AGR dues. Now, why is this happening? It is happening because of a surprising turn that this entire series of events has taken. Under IBC, Department of Telecommunication will be an operational creditor, not a financial creditor, an operational creditor in whose respect some dues are pending. These companies already have thousands and thousands of crores in debt already pending in favor of financial creditors such as banks. Most of them being led by a consortium, most of them offered by a consortium led by SBI. In case of an IBC proceeding, the resolution plan is offered by another company which offers to take over the operations of this company and pay off the existing debts and dues to a certain extent, after which it will start off with a fresh slate. So, in case of, let's say, Reliance Communication, in case a resolution plan comes in, that company says that I'll pay this particular amount of money to settle the existing debts and dues and debts fully and finally. After that, I'll not be bound by any other existing debt or due. Essentially, I'll be starting with a fresh slate with this company. In normal situations, this does not really pose much of an issue, considering that financial creditors have the most stake in the game, and most of the money that is received under a resolution plan is being distributed amongst the financial creditors themselves. However, in this case, Department of Telecommunication has dues worth 14,000, 20,000, 30,000 crores, which is higher than most of these consortium, the entirety of the consortium loans that are given out. In case the IBC proceeding is allowed to be continued and money is received under a resolution plan, the possibility of Department of Telecommunication getting anything is very less. Normally, a substantial haircut has to be taken by all the creditors, but the amount of money that comes to an operational creditor ranges somewhat less than 1000 crores. So in case an IBC proceeding is allowed to continue, the amount that the DOT can expect to recover will be substantially less than what it needs to recover. This resolution plan also hinges on the possibility of spectrum being sold alongside the company's assets. A resolution plan is only submitted if the potential buyer finds some interesting USP with the company which they can leverage and make use of in order to achieve results in the future. In the case of telecommunication companies, that is a spectrum license which is allotted to them. However, Supreme Court has made it clear that spectrum, since it does not belong to the companies themselves, cannot be sold alongside other assets in an IBC proceeding. In the absence of spectrum, the most valuable asset of a telecom company, the possibility of receiving any resolution plan is bleak. The State Bank of India argued recently in the Supreme Court that in case the spectrum is not made a part of the assets of the company, there's a huge possibility that companies such as Aircel, Videocon and Reliance will have to be liquidated in order for them to receive their dues. In which case, a public sector bank funded by taxpayers' money will lose out a major chunk of money. So it's a two-edged sword that we are standing on right now. On the one hand is the fact that spectrum cannot be sold since it does not belong to the company itself, it belongs to the government. We have given out a license to a telecom company to use it. In case that is allowed, DOT will not be able to recover its dues. However, SBI and other public sector banks might recover a major chunk of the money that is due to them. It has to be allowed, for if it is not allowed, then no resolution plan will come for these companies, and then these companies will have to undergo liquidation, at the end of which the recovery which comes in may not be enough to account for the huge NPAs that these telecom companies already are in the loan books of the public sector banks. So the way I see it is that both ways it's the public which is losing the money. So the Supreme Court has to take the call rather carefully, to my understanding, and as of recording, the final judgment on this matter is reserved by the Supreme Court and has not yet come out. I hope that the Supreme Court will take a prudent decision, because it will create a precedent for the future cases as well, in case of companies where government dues are pending. In case the Supreme Court does allow the spectrum license to be sold alongside the assets of the telecom companies, this can be used as an argument in future cases where government dues are pending in respect of private companies, and the banks argue that the government asset present with these private companies be sold off as well. There's another issue which has come to my attention, is that recently Bharti Mittal, he recently made this comment that in case the AGR dues have to be paid, the current model which has been adopted by telecom companies will not be sustainable, because there's no possibility of providing, let's say, 16 GB data at 160 rupees. What you can do is you can provide 1.6 GB data for 160 rupees in a month. As a feasible economic model to be adopted, the current model which has been adopted by most of the telecom companies in India is not sustainable in the long run anyway. And in case the AGR dues have to be paid by the company in a short period of time, this model has to be disbanded very quickly. Now, it is important to remember that a lot of technological innovations that have happened over the past 4 5 years have taken place on the back of the fact that data usage on cellular networks has become affordable for the majority of Indians. It is because of having data plans whereby you get 1 GB or 1.5 GB data per day for a minimal amount of, let's say, 150 rupees or 200 rupees, that a lot of people are able to access the internet in the first place. And a lot of government plans of digitizing this country, the entire jam trinity, Jandhan, Aadhaar, and mobile banking, all of these are dependent primarily on the ability of the common Indian to access internet at a reasonable amount. And in case these telecom companies choose to increase the prices dramatically, as Bharti Mittal has suggested, it might be disastrous for the country in the long run. It is also important to remember that after this AGR issue has been settled, we might be looking at a future where there are only two telecom companies operating in the country. Two telecom companies which, if they agree upon an increase in the prevailing rates at which data and calls are being offered, there will be no resort. The common person will not have any choice and will have to accept whatever is being offered to him or her. It is not unnatural if you suddenly start feeling like that landlord from the story I told you in the beginning. You have to recover your money. It's a huge amount, and it is what is owed to you. Remember, the telecom companies have not paid a penny. They have been operating in this country for the past 2 decades, earning all those revenues that they have been earning without paying a penny in return to the government of India. There's no argument in place to be made that we should just forego this amount altogether. It's 1.6 lakh crores. There's also no argument to be made that we should allow our banks to forego their legitimate dues. But in case we allow this to happen, in either cases, we are looking at a situation which Bharti Mittal has warned us about: increase in prices of telecom services in the country, which in turn will also affect the future growth prospects of this country. There's no simple, clear-cut solution that I can give to you. What I can hope is that Supreme Court will look into all these factors while coming to its decision. The Supreme Court has made categorical statements like, the sovereign owns the spectrum, you do not own the spectrum. And since we are the masters of this entire affair and we will not let these companies get away with not paying the government dues, we have to take the national approach here. What that might be, quite honestly, I'm not sure. Anyways, that was me explaining the AGR issue to you in as brief a manner as possible. If you liked the episode, please share this with as many people as you can. Please let me know in whatever manner you can, through Twitter, through comments in the listening podcast that you're listening to, how you liked the episode and what other issues you would like me to cover in the future. Till then, this is me, Abhilash Agrawal, signing off. Take care.